and welcome to earreadthis, Edinburgh's most powerful book podcast. And today's interview is going to underscore just what being Edinburgh's most powerful book podcast is all about. For my first on-the-ground interview, I was joined by Donald Smith for a walking tour of literary sites of interest in Edinburgh's Old Town. Donald is the founding director of the Scottish Storytelling Centre, where we end our tour today, about 500 yards and 900 years of bookish history from where we set off. Even in as short a walk as that, it is impossible to pack in the amount of literary history Edinburgh has to offer on every corner, and so I warmly recommend Edinburgh, Our Storied Town, which is Donald's latest book, telling the story of this city's storytellers, from St Margaret to Muriel Spark. If you'd like to order a copy of the book, I'll leave a link in the episode description box below. And if you're listening to the audio version of this podcast and would like a visual reference of where we are in the city, the version on YouTube will feature some cutting-edge footage on the ground intercut with a street map. We begin our journey with some words of encouragement to fellow travellers from none other than Robert Louis Stevenson.
We're here in the corner of Drummond Street and the South Bridge, heart of Edinburgh's Old South Side. And we're here because Robert Louis Stevenson stood here when he was a student. And he remembered that years later when he was in the South Seas. And he said, when I remembered, all I hoped and feared as I pickled about Rutherford's in the rain. So Rutherford's is the pub that was behind us here, the student house. In the rain and the east wind, how I feared I should make a mere shipwreck. I feared I should never have a friend, far less a wife, and yet passionately hoped I might. How I hoped if I did not take to drink, I should possibly write one little book. And then now, what a change I feel somehow, as if I should like this incident set upon a brass plate at the corner of that dreary thoroughfare for all students to read, poor devils, when their hearts are down. And here it is.
Here to keep our spirits up.
Yeah. Here was Stevenson.
Yeah.
In the depths of gloom and depression.
Yeah.
And, might I write one little book if I didn't take to drink? And strangely, at the very opposite corner of the street, in the cafe on the first floor there's now a Chinese restaurant, a certain young writer, a single mum, J.K. Rowling, sat down with a determination to write a book, which turned out to be Harry Potter.
Of course, that was it Spoon?
Yeah,
or was it? Yeah.
So there's a kind of thing here about, we're in the haunt of the old South Side, the student world, and that sense of kind of aspiration and inspiration. And interestingly, Rutherford's pub, now long gone, and an Italian restaurant, which still remembers the Stevenson connection. Yeah. In the 1930s, Hugh McDermott, Sorley MacLean, and George Davy, the philosopher, met here for the first time. George Davy introduced them to each other. And that was the beginnings of the bubble of a Scottish literary renaissance, with those poets writing in Scots and Gaelic. Yeah. And that began with a conversation right here.
So we're right in a triangle of literary history.
We're in the heart,
yeah.
But it's not old establishment stuff. To remember, people start at the very bottom of all this, struggling with ideas and inspiration. And this Drummond Street, we should head along and get a feel for it.
Yeah, this is perfect timing, because the last thing the last little video I did was finished on a Stevenson plaque. It was at Ferguson's grave.
Yes.
So
yes.
We've gone from hops from Stevenson.
The three Roberts.
Yeah, exactly.
Burns,
yeah.
Ferguson, Stevenson.
I didn't quite realise how many more Roberts there were in connection with Ferguson. Robert Garrick, or I'm not pronouncing it.
Well,
quite
some
right.
people say Geary, but it's it doesn't matter. He would have been the last person, incidentally, to care.
Oh, really?
He was an interesting, modest man. Yeah. So, coming along Drummond Street here, interestingly, we don't know the exact house, but somewhere along here in the early 70s, David Bowie hung out. And he was sharing digs with Lindsay Kemp, the really flamboyant mime artist.
Yeah.
And they had some kind of gig or contract in Edinburgh, maybe at the old Empire Theatre that's now the Festival Theatre.
Yeah.
And they had their digs here. And that just gives you a feel of what the old South Side, you know, we're surrounded by the old schools. This one that is about to become the hub for the Fringe.
Yeah.
And for performances. So it's nice to think David Bowie, Lindsay Kemp, and now the Fringe is here
in
too.
The mix, yeah.
So we're just going to stand here for a second for a sight line. Okay, this is the thing about being in the real places, right? So we're looking right down that way towards the Pleasance, and just at the corner there is the Flodden Wall, and this way we're looking back towards Old College, originally the Kirk of Field. Now this sight line is critical to understanding what happened on the night that Mary Queen of Scots' husband Darnley was lowered from the gunpowder-packed Kirkfield house in a chair, took refuge in an orchard, which was on the other side of the wall, there in College Street, where he was murdered. And to understand what was going on that night, this is the critical place, and of course celebrated in endless dramas and novels and films and all the rest of it, because basically Darnley thought he was about to assassinate Mary.
Yeah.
It was a double
Triple.
plot.
Absolutely.
Absolutely.
I think you describe it in the book as a double triple cross that keeps going.
Absolutely. And but the thing was that Mary, instead of coming back that night to sleep in Kirkfield, stayed at Holyrood. So the whole thing was up in the air. When our bold boy Bothwell, who was in the plot, decided he would set out from Holyrood, he came along Holyrood Road, what's Holyrood Road now, up round the corner of the wall with torches blazing. So sightline, up in Kirkfield House, they saw them coming with the torch and thought, this is Mary coming, it's time to light the fuse.
Yeah.
So they lit the fuse. By this, they'd given up, they thought she wasn't going to come, but when they saw the procession with the torches, they lit the fuse, they lowered Darnley out, he went over into the orchard where he was waiting to be taken away to be made the king, and instead they strangled him and left him for dead, and then boom, up went Kirkfield House. But he wasn't killed in the explosion, he was assassinated. So this is the spot where the plot was reactivated when it looked as if it wasn't going to happen. And we're going to come back to that because it's a drama number that just keeps echoing through Scottish theatre and literature, and in fact world theatre and literature, you know.
It's just mad to think it's so all of it is so close. All of it is so...
It's very immediate. That's the fantastic thing, I think, about literature and culture in Edinburgh. The shape of everything is still here.
Yeah.
And we're going to go now, in which I think people find slightly unexpected. We're going to cut down into High School yards on our way down towards the Cowgate and up towards Blackfriars Street. And there we're going to see this thing, how the Enlightenment, everybody says, oh, the Enlightenment, that was in the new town and whatever, all started here in the old town. So we'll just get a vivid example of that as we come down here into High School yards. This is part of the university now, but it was part of the hospital, and before that this site was the school, the Edinburgh High School yards, and this is where Walter Scott went to school. And once we get down into the middle of this, we begin to see all the different layers, and this building tucked away in here, also now part of the university on the edge of High School yards, was Old Surgeons' Hall. So this is one of those really early Enlightenment things, you know, the medics, the physicians and the surgeons all having their associations and their guilds and so forth, and they had a great interest in literature. So for example, Archibald Pitcairn worked for the physicians. They had their office a wee bit further down there, just off the high street, and he was a radical Jacobite poet and anti-Presbyterian dramatist. But he wasn't able to put any of his plays on. He had to circulate them like Russian samizdat literature, satirizing. So that kind of thing where even in the 1600s, where Presbyterianism still had an iron grip, there was the beginning of this whole Enlightenment movement, and it begins here in the old town. So this is part of High School Yards, and as we come through here, what we realise, so this is layers and layers, is that before the hospital, and the oldest bit of the hospital is right in front of us here, and before the school, we had the Blackfriars Friary, the Dominican Friary was here. And when this building was created, they found some of the monks' burials. And it's this thing that these spaces that were originally the monasteries, the friaries, the Kirkfield, the Grey Friars, after the Reformation, they became the property of the town council. And this is where we saw schools and hospitals and new initiatives coming to the fore that were to be very important in the literature and culture of Edinburgh. So there's still a Dominican friary, which is now in George Square, and there was a very distinguished principal of that friary, Anthony Ross, Father Anthony Ross, in late 20th century, who was a pioneer in supporting arts and literature in prisons.
Oh.
And he was the person who encouraged the life sentence prisoner Jimmy Boyle to discover art and to write his very notable autobiography, A Sense of Confinement, about the way in which art and literature and creativity could refashion a sense of life experience, even for people who'd started really at the bottom of the pile in the most difficult circumstances. So we're now coming to the Cowgate, and we're heading towards Blackfriars Street. Now, just as we come down into the Cowgate, there's a rather nondescript building here, which is the city mortuary. And this frequently figures in all the Inspector Rebus novels, the dark, gruesome literature, the McCleavey 19th century detectives. And this, of course, is a fragmentary survival of the hospital having been originally here. So, as I said, the high school yards, the hospital that would come through in the old Blackfriars site, still was this surviving relic, if you like, of all that this is where the corpses were delivered.
Okay.
And of course, that was the source of all the dark legendary stuff about the body snatchers and people who stopped digging up dead corpses and decided just to create a few fresh as a new market opportunity. So it's just interesting that that's still with us, just as a kind of echo. And as you see, we actually have come down High School Wine there, and we're coming into Blackfriars Street, but just as we begin at the foot here, interesting little plaque reminding us that this is where the first printer and publisher in Edinburgh started, 1511, and it was a patriotic venture sponsored by James IV, the great Renaissance and literary king, who wanted the literature of Scotland to be published and disseminated and celebrated. And it was interesting that at the beginning, though, the first productions, they were to do with saints' legends and the liturgy of the old church. And then there were all the romances from the oral tradition. All of this was published, but of course, this was to become a vehicle of radical new thinking and ideas and debate and discussion. And as we'll see as we go further up, even to this day, this area is a centre of printing and publishing. So these things have an extraordinarily long survival. And of course, when the first printers were set up here, this was quite a posh area. And just in the corner there was Cardinal Beaton's mansion house, where Mary Queen of Scots had her first banquet of welcome when she came back from exile in France. But later, Blackfriars Street was to become notorious as a slum. And Robert Louis Stevenson, this is one of the areas he haunted when he was sort of discovering the dark side of life, the wild side of life.
His velvet jacket days.
Absolutely. And in the 20th century, a well-known poet and playwright, Donald Campbell, who was born just round the corner here in the Cowgate, wrote a play called Blackfriars Wind about Stevenson in the street here.
Oh, wow.
A fantastically successful play, which I had the pleasure of producing twice with my Old Town Theatre company. And it was a great celebration of the life of this very mixed character street, you know. Just when I was researching this Edinburgh Storied town, you know, the literary angle on the 900th anniversary of Edinburgh, I found out something quite extraordinary that I didn't know, that I had no idea of. And that was that in the 1700s, when James Macpherson was writing his Ossian poems, which was to be a romantic sensation, he was lodging here in Blackfriars Street. And not only that, he was in a flat below Professor Hugh Blair, who was the professor of literature and rhetoric at the university. He was actually a reverend in the Enlightenment spirit. And Macpherson was producing these supposed translations. I mean, he wasn't really a forger. It was a genuine Ossian tradition, but he was producing these supposed translations and then passing them a floor up for Blair to give them the once over. Yes! And Blair produced an essay, on primitive poetry, and it's wonderful. So I thought that was kind of rather wonderful, you know.
Yeah.
I was quite pleased with that. Now, if we just slip round here, this is what I love. Hi, Peter. We're just doing a wee... we don't need to go far in here to get the sense of it, but this became known in the 19th century and then the early 20th century as Little Ireland.
Oh, I saw that.
Because there were so many people, and we get a sense of it just in the back courts here. This was it was a poorer community, and people, you know, all the well-off types, the Hugh Blairs et al., had moved off by this time to the new town, and these were crowded back closes and courts and housing, full of immigrants from the Highlands and Ireland. The key literary interest or connection here is James Connolly, the Irish Republican and political theorist. And what is interesting is important in that they've just recently been publishing some of this early Connolly stuff. So Connolly, he was born just on the High Street near Crubber's Close there, and his family lived here, and he lived when he was first married just on the south side, quite close to where we've just been in Drummond Street. And all his early political writings, including some plays and dramatic monologues and whatever, were written here in Edinburgh about socialism and international justice, and he was writing in the Evening News. the Edinburgh Evening Dispatch, the Scotsman, the Labour Herald, or whatever. A really significant volume of very, very well crafted political articles and campaigning and agitation. So that's an interesting aspect of the kind of Little Ireland thing. I always think we've sort of edited James Connolly out a bit because of the later history, notable history of his role in the Easter Rising in 1916. But, for a whole decade, he was writing and working as a socialist agitator right here.
That's one of the I was really struck by that in the book. The whole, you keep coming back to this, the whole idea of the canon and the tradition, and how many different people have tried to, beginning with sort of Chapman and Miller onwards, to set down what that tradition is and decide who gets in and who gets out.
I think that's right. Yeah. But do you know, the extraordinary thing is there's this resilience in it all, that it keeps busting the barriers of, they're the canon, they're the tradition, and then we find somebody else.
Yes.
And then of course there's the stuff that we just has kind of been forgotten and is under layers of stuff. And a prime example of that is the visits of Shakespeare's company to perform here in this street in Blackfriars Wynd in Edinburgh in the 1500s. Now, how the hell could this happen? Well, because theatre was banned apart from anything else. But of course, James VI, later to become first of England, Ireland, etc., was mad keen on theatre. And he married Anne of Denmark, who was equally mad keen on theatre. So Shakespeare's company, we don't think Shakespeare, there's no evidence that Shakespeare himself travelled. 3 different times they toured to Edinburgh, and James organised a temporary theatre for them here in Blackfriars Street, defying the town council's ban on theatre. And when you think about it, that amazing scene in Hamlet, where Hamlet rushes out to tell the players how to act, don't saw your hands, it's just like, I imagine that's like James pelting up from Holyrood to give the actors his views on theatre, just as he'd given the poets his instructions about theatrical style. So, and these visits, of course, because they knew James was likely to succeed, conveyed then some of the intelligence about what was the kind of stuff that dramatists should think about creating. So then, of course, we got Macbeth, obsession with witchcraft, and of course we got Hamlet, which is set in Elsinore, where James and Anne had their honeymoon, and where that story's set. And of course, in a deeper and darker kind of way, the story of Macbeth, Hamlet, the story of Hamlet, where Hamlet's father is assassinated, supposedly, by his mother's lover, who then marries the lover, who becomes it. This is supposedly James VI's autobiography. I don't think it is. I think it's all black propaganda, but still, it's incredibly powerful.
Too close not to notice.
Yeah, and it taps in. And strangely, this whole thing about surviving things, if you have a sense of how to read them, if we just look across here to what's the High Street Hostel, this was the Earl of Morton's townhouse, head of the Douglas clan, and he was the guy who organised the strong-arm stuff to assassinate Darnley. It was his, henchmen that were waiting in the orchard to finish off poor cousin Darnley. And later, eventually, Morton, he became the regent of Scotland and all this stuff, but eventually, when James came of age, he put him on trial
Yeah.
for his part in Darnley's murder, which he always denied, and he was executed with a guillotine, what they called the Maiden, the first person to be executed with a guillotine in Scotland, which was an invention that he had introduced as the regent.
Gosh. So it's a shadow of the tradition of Deacon Brodie.
It is.
Getting
It is.
hanged on his own scaffold.
It is, and you can still actually see the Douglas coat of arms, Morton's coat of arms, above that,
right.
the old surviving bit there
Yeah.
of the thing. So that whole story still resonates.
Wow.
We're going to go. We're
Quite good.
going to go through this way. Let's just pass by Little Ireland, because I mentioned this thing that this whole area then had a continuing tradition of publishing and of literary activity. And if we slip in here, just kind of moving through Little Ireland, back towards the High Street, but through the closes and the courts at the back, we'll get a wee sense of this literary thing. And again, a funny mix here, you know, of 19th century tenements, of much older buildings like Coyne House there, and then of 20th century restorations trying to bring a bit of sense of community back into an area that had really fallen into incredible disrepair, you know. So just on our right here is the headquarters of the Saltire Society. So our Hugh McDermott and George Davy and Sorley MacLean and others, Naomi Mitchison and many others, they were very much involved in getting the Saltire Society going, and also Scottish Pen, the writers' organisation. And Saltire were to play quite a major role in reprinting and publishing Scottish literature for a sort of modern audience. And then, of course, it grew away beyond these original organisations, and right next door we have Canongate Publishers, which of course are of international fame and renown, but occupy the Publishers building of Oliver and Boyd. So originally this was the townhouse of the Earl of Tweedsmuir. So Oliver and Boyd were an 18th and 19th century publisher who published Walter Scott and James Hogg and all the people of that period. And I think it's fantastic that the same building is still in use. And I think at one juncture, even our friend Archibald Pitcairn was down here. And it's there's still, this is a fragment. We passed the fragment of the Flodden Wall, and we were thinking about that line of sight as Bothwell came up towards Kirkfield. So this is a fragment of the King's Wall, which was the earlier town wall before Flodden Wall.
Wow.
Yeah. So here on our right, so it's this connection between much more recent things. So in the late 80s, there was this big agitation and campaign to create a Scottish poetry library. And the poetry library is now located in a beautiful modern building down in the Canongate.
Yeah.
But it began here, in this building here. And the passionate leader of all this, it was interesting to see women writers then coming to the fore, was Tessa Ransford, herself a visionary poet, but a very, very determined woman who was going to see this poetry library created come hell or high water. And so in the earlier, here in, as it's known, Tweeddale Court, you know, with the Errol down here originally, there were outdoor, during the festival, outdoor readings and a terrific kind of literary energy.
It's lovely acoustics for readings. I was just noticing.
Isn't it so? Because we're right on the main high street. We're just off the high street here.
And it's the quietest bit.
It's got a really lovely acoustic.
Yeah.
So that building, believe it or not, was a garage for sedan chairs. When those are such as those, I mean, I was expecting, to be carried round tonight,
Yeah, sorry, the sedan chair didn't come through. Like the memory card.
No. So, we come back out here, and the interest really of this location, and we're going to kind of finish our journey here with one or two things, is this whole area was known as the Nether Bow because the main city gate was here, and originally it was in that narrowing right where John Knox's house stands, and the Nether Bow just means the lower bend, so that's where the street narrowed to the gate, and then after the disaster of Flodden it was hurriedly moved down to the crossroads here to take in all the houses that had built themselves on the old
Right.
So this Netherbow area, as it were, what was a cluster of this literary and cultural activity and experience, and all of these places that we've just seen tucked in here on the south side of the High Street are complemented by, we have Scottish Book Trust and the Coburn Association, Coburn in his guise as a writer, as well as a defender of Edinburgh's architectural heritage. So right on this Netherbow, John Knox's house was saved because of this belief that John Knox had died here, and then the modern storytelling centre was created here. And this panel survives from the old Netherbow port or gate.
Wow.
And what's fascinating about it is, so we have Jacobus Rex 6, Anna Regina. So this is James 6 and first and Anne of Denmark. And it says, God save the king, and then it has his personal motto, Beati Pacifici, blessed are the peacemakers. And then it says 1606. So why, by this time James has gone to London, why have we got something put up here in 1606? He doesn't come back until 1619 or something. And but so in the town council records it says that this was put on the Netherbow port to commemorate the survival of their sacred majesties from the gunpowder plot.
Of course.
Guy Fawkes, you see, November before.
Yeah.
And they put this up to show how loyal we are to the monarchy up here, and by the way, James, you've still got a capital up here. And
Don't forget where you're from.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And you still owe us a lot of money. And the wonderful phrasing was, they were delivered, their sacred majesties delivered from, and you think, what, the gunpowder plot? The papist plot? No, the English plot to kill the king.
Yeah. Wouldn't happen here.
I know, absolutely. Now, this, surely the most misunderstood building in Edinburgh, and one of its oldest, and one of its most important in terms of literary and cultural terms. So, what is now called John Knox's house, from the tradition or belief that he died here, which is very possible, but there's no ultimate proof. This was the house of the Royal Goldsmiths, and they put this motto, which is the oldest carved inscription in Edinburgh, on the front of their building, just as Mary Queen of Scots was coming back and being restored to the throne. And it says, Louv God above all, and your neighbour as yourself. So it's in the Scots of that time, which would be used not just in speech, but in literature, with those Chapman and Miller printers and publishers that we've passed over there that you were mentioning. But where does this come from? So people think, oh, this must be quite religious, so does it come from John Knox? But it's nothing to do with John Knox. In fact, it comes from the Roman Catholic reformers who wanted to reform the church and prevent there being a Protestant split. And they selected these phrases from the Latin scriptures and had them translated into Scots so as people would memorise these key principles. So love God above all and your neighbour and yourself reiterates the moral philosophy of the Roman Catholic Church, that faith is not enough without good works. And to drive the point home, here, later believed to have been a sculpture of John Knox, is Moses receiving the law of Moses on Mount Sinai. And of course, love God above all and your neighbour as yourself is what Christ is supposed to have said when he was asked what is the most important thing in the Torah, the law of Moses. And he said, you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart and all your strength. So this is a whole lesson in moral philosophy and theology from the Roman Catholic Church.
Right.
And so, but it's also a really precious bit of literary, and linguistic heritage that it's there. But of course, to counter this, it is likely that in this same building, which had been confiscated from the goldsmiths because of their support of Mary Queen of Scots, John Knox died still writing, fulminating his so-called history of the story of the Protestant Reformation, which is one hell of a racy read. And because of religious controversy, people don't read it as literature. But it's not history. It's a completely passionate apologia written with scorn and fury and satire and very gutsy, very dramatic. And I would say it's one of Scotland's first early modern novels. And really it's a good read.
Yeah.
And he pegged out, unfortunately, still calling down curses on Mary's supporters or whatever, and not having finished. But even to the last few days, with he'll draw breath, he's still dictating, because he was determined to get in his version, So this building, for all that it's a precious piece of architectural history, it's religious importance, it also has a huge literary importance in Scotland's story. And that dramatic clash. But of course, this wasn't to be the only clash of drama in history that's reflected in literature. And here, in this building, we're going to go up. I want to take you up here,
Sure.
because I want to show you a little bit. I've talked about sight lines here, okay? We looked at the sight line where, Bothwell was coming down to do the dirty business. So, on this little landing, Daniel Foe, who was later to write Robinson Crusoe, supposedly having got the idea on his tour of Scotland. Daniel Foe, this was before he was Defoe.
You got the D.
Yeah. Was a spy and a propagandist paid by the English government to be here in Edinburgh to support the Union. And he had multiple identities. He was pretending to be a businessman who said that if the Union went through, he was going to set up a salt factory. He was sending material by mail back to London to publish propagandistic pamphlets, and he was sending secret reports on the behaviour and inclinations of the members of the Scottish Parliament, where he was attending various committees. And in all these different capacities, he had different pseudonyms, But he writes this most amazing eyewitness account, which is set right here, where he says he came out of his lodging and there was this huge demo. He could hear this huge demo coming up the high street from the Cannon Gate, and the town guard were coming down to block it. And it was in the darkness, and the demonstrators were carrying torches, and they were shouting, "No union, no union." It was a popular denouncing this attempt, which of course was very unpopular in England as well, to unite England and Scotland. And the town guard came down here to try and hold the crowd back at the city gate, at the Netherbow, and Defoe describes how they were just swept aside. And they just poured up, this huge mob shouting, "No union, no union." And he says, "We're going to do that now." He says, "I drew back into the shadows." I drew back into the shadows where he could witness this, but in safety, you know? So I wrote about this myself in a novel called The English Spy, because that was another of those key moments of conflict and drama that were to be the kind of energizer of writers, of playwrights, of poets. So then in the 18th century, you really have these two sort of camps where you have people that are hearkening back, wanting, a nation of Scotland, and a lot of them are supporting the Jacobites as a way they see of restoring this kind of national culture. And there's songs and there's poets, Alan Ramsay, Robert Ferguson, Burns later, they're all Jacobites.
Yeah.
And then on the other side, there's the Hugh Blairs and the Adam Smiths, whoever else say, well, actually, that through this union we can sort of develop and prosper, and we will become a literary nation. We will become, as Hume said, the most historical of nations, because we have this huge understanding of history, and we are going to excel through our literary and our intellectual work, and out of that comes the Enlightenment. Or let's say out of the clash of these two things comes the Enlightenment. And so that sense of a continuity of literary creation within different conflicting traditions that produces this energy goes right on to this very day, where the writers still address and tackle this. But as we've seen, we can actually walk it. We can actually see the locations, and
it's so close from the Darnley assassination onwards. You kind of picture it, people being on either side of a city or something, and they're not. They're in the stone's throw of each other.
Absolutely,
all the way through.
It's very compact,
Yeah.
and that goes back to, of course, there is being a city built within the walls. And even just as we're standing here at the Netherbow Port, one of the things that I love is we can look up the high street there. And, we're seeing the Tron, and then St Giles, and then the Edinburgh Festival Hub, and then we're just seeing Edinburgh Castle at the top there. And if we look down, if we could stand safely in this road, this is why we need to get rid of cars, we actually will just catch sight of the Scottish Parliament. The big windows on the debating chamber.
Yeah.
I wonder if we can just catch that. Maybe we need to be a wee bit further up. Yeah, so just at the very foot, you just catch the debating chamber windows, which are almost certainly modelled on the fenestration, as they say, of these John Knox House windows. That you actually, and there's this echo.
Yeah.
I mean, it's a work of contemporary genius.
Yeah.
And as you know, I finished my book on Edwin Muir's celebration of open the doors of this. He said that this is the place the Parliament should be, and these are the kind of values, and what we need is the poets and the writers to nag the politicians into doing the right thing and realising the best possible aspirations of the democracy of Scotland for the future. I thought, wouldn't it be interesting to do this? I've never actually done this little walk with anybody, but I often do it myself, and I think, isn't this incredible?
Yeah.
That within this little span, I mean, how far have we walked? Not more than a few hundred yards.
No, not more than a few hundred yards.
No,
and
no.
we've basically
Yeah.
tunnelled a hole through your whole book, virtually, in terms of the history covered.
I know,
Yeah.
which is interesting. So it's a good way to do it, and focus, people in place,
Yeah.
because people, they can only bear so much
Yeah.
detail, and